Chapter 7 of Travels in the Central Parts of Indo-China, Siam, Cambodia and Laos, during the years 1858, 59 and 60, by Henri Mouhot. All my preparations for departure having been completed, the Abbé Hestrest came in the morning on the day fixed, to invite me to breakfast with him, after which he offered to take me in his own boat to Kompong Bay, where the promised vehicles were to meet us. When we arrived there, none were to be seen. We applied to the first mandarin, who, chewing his betel, displayed his black teeth with a stupid grin, and I then perceived that I had been duped by these people, who are always and everywhere false, never yielding, but to force, and holding the very name of a European in detestation. After various complaints and remonstrances with the mandarins, we, with great difficulty, obtained 3 carriages, by courtesy so called, but the dog-cars in use in Holland would have been more serviceable to me, so I sent back the 3 wheelbarrows to the king, with my compliments, and hired other vehicles for myself. Udong, the present capital of Cambodia, is situated northeast of Komput, and is 4.5 miles from that arm of the Mekong which forms the Great Lake, lying about 135 miles from Komput as the crow flies. It is reckoned an 8 days' journey, travelling with oxen or buffaloes, and there are 8 stations on the way. With elephants you can accomplish it in half the time, but only the king, the mandarins, and very wealthy persons can afford to keep these animals. The conveyances which I had engaged could scarcely hold my baggage, so that my men were obliged to make the journey on foot. Perceiving in the shops several necklaces, bracelets, and rings, formed of a material like jet, I inquired from whence it was procured, and was told that it came from the neighbouring island of Phuket, where it was to be found in abundance. I afterwards handled a piece of this substance, and discovered it to be a sort of coal. It would burn well in a lamp, and greatly resembles the kennel coal of Scotland. After traversing a marshy plain where we knocked down several aquatic birds, we encountered a beautiful forest, which stretches unbroken to the very gates of Udong. To cross this marsh, I had to put on my hunting boots, which I had not worn for some time, and consequently the leather had hardened so much that after 2 days' walking in the heat of the day, the skin was rubbed off my feet in several places, and I was forced to take off the boots and continue my journey barefoot. Luckily, owing to the dry weather and the constant communication between Komput and the capital, the road was almost everywhere in good condition. The heat was intense, and our progress excessively slow. But at length we reached the first station, where I was lodged in a large hall, thatched and built of bamboo, which had been erected for the accommodation of the king and his suite. At night, guards were stationed at my door to protect me from robbery, and, thanks to the royal letter which I carried, I was respectfully treated. On the following morning I managed, at the cost of a franc of our money, to hire an elephant to take me as far as the next station. From thence I continued my route barefoot, and our sufferings from the heat exceeded all I had ever imagined of the effect of the sun in the torrid zone. Its burning rays, falling on the sandy soil, became intolerable at 10 o'clock in the morning, so that even the natives, the soles of whose feet were much harder than mine, could not bear contact with the bare ground, but sought for tufts of grass to step upon. The oxen could scarcely move, and showed every sign of pain and exhaustion, and in spite of spurring and blows, often refused to stir. The water in the ponds was not warm, but literally hot. The whole atmosphere seemed on fire, and all nature languishing and prostrate. At 10 o'clock we halted until 3. We sadly felt the want of drinkable water, as also did our cattle, which suffered from thirst even more than ourselves. To make our tea and cook our rice we had no resource but the stagnant pools, impregnated with unwholesome matter by the vomica nuts which fall from the surrounding trees. The day following I was fortunate enough to obtain another elephant, but after this there was no more help to be met with, and the greater part of the ensuing 4 days' journey I performed on foot, my attendants contriving to perch themselves in the corners of one of the wagons. At this dry season, a broad track in the middle of the road, which altogether is from 25 to 30 metres in width, is beaten hard by the frequent passage of vehicles and elephants, and the fine thick dust arising from it is very annoying. The remainder of the road is covered with grass and shrubs, and on either hand is the forest, with its trees, tall, straight, and majestic, surmounted by immense tufts of leaves. The effect is that of a magnificent avenue, and from the regularity of the intervals between the trees, one might almost believe that it had been laid out by the hand of art. The stations are equidistant from each other, about 12 miles apart, and at all of them, besides the old caravanserais, for the shelter of ordinary travellers, new ones, much more spacious and ornamental, have been erected for the accommodation of the king. There are also intermediate resting places between every 2 stations, where travellers can obtain a welcome shelter from the midday heat. On leaving Komput, a low chain of hills came in sight on our left hand, but everywhere on our route we met with the same sandy soil, except in a single spot, which was stony and contained veins of iron ore. We passed through but one village, and there only were a few attempts at cultivation. In no other part of the forest could I distinguish any traces of its being inhabited. On approaching the capital, the prospect became more diversified. We passed fields of rice, cottages encircled by fruit gardens, and country houses belonging to the Cambodian aristocracy, who come here in the evening for the sake of breathing a purer air than they can find in the city. As we drew closer to the gates, I found the place to be protected by a large moat, surmounted by a parapet, and enclosed by a palisade 3 meters high. I expected to enter a fortified town, and as my countrymen were now engaged in giving a lesson to the Cochin Chinese, to be received by a sentinel with fixed bayonet, and with the startling words, "You cannot pass." But seeing no one, I pushed open the gate and entered. It seemed that I was in the enclosure surrounding the palace of the second king. The first object that attracted my attention was a sort of cage, something between a sentry box and a pigeon house, with a small window at each of the 4 sides, intended for a lookout house and signal station in case of invasion. I then found myself in the centre of a large square surrounded by ramparts, and the access to which is by 2 gates, one opening on the marketplace and the other on the country. Within this walled space is, on one side, the palace of the inferior king, and opposite are the residence of a younger prince, his brother, and a pagoda. All these buildings were thatched. I hoped to find here, as at Komput, an hotel for the king and ambassadors, but not seeing any sign hung out, I bent my steps to a house where many persons were passing in and out. It was the Hall of Justice. The judges were then sitting. I sent my man New to ask if they would give shelter to a traveller, and had not long to wait for an answer, for both judges and accused came out to see me, and I was brought into the hall, where I was an object of great curiosity, all crowding round me and asking me what I sold. The news of my arrival soon reached the ears of the king, and 2 pages were sent to request me to wait at once on his majesty. But my luggage was not yet forthcoming, and I objected that I could not visit him in my travelling dress. "Oh, that is nothing. The king has no dress at all, and he'll be delighted to see you," was the reply. Scarcely had my wagons arrived when a chamberlain, followed by a page, came to say that the king was waiting for me. I went therefore to the palace, before the entrance of which were a dozen dismounted cannon, in whose mouths the sparrows had built their nests. Further off, a crowd of vultures were devouring the remains from the table of the king and his courtiers. I was ushered into the audience chamber, which communicates with His Majesty's private apartments, and is paved with large Chinese tiles, the walls being whitened with chalk. A number of Siamese pages, fine young men from 25 to 30 years of age, uniformly dressed in a languti of red silk, were standing in groups, or seated in oriental fashion, waiting the king's appearance. A few minutes after my arrival he entered, and every forehead was bowed to the ground. I rose, and he advanced towards me, with an air at once easy and distinguished. "Sire," said I had the honour of an interview with the first king at Komput, and of being favoured by him with permission to visit Udong. "Are you French or English?" he asked, examining me attentively. "I am a Frenchman, sire." "You are not a merchant. Why do you come to Cambodia?" "Sire, I came to Siam to see your country, and to hunt here, if allowed." "Very good. You have been in Siam? I also have visited Bangkok. Come and see me again, as often as my presence will be agreeable to your Majesty." After a few more minutes' conversation, the king held out to me his hand, which I kissed, and I then retired, but had not proceeded far when several officials ran after me, exclaiming, "The king is enchanted with you. He wants to see you often." The following day I devoted to making an investigation of the city. The houses are built of bamboos or planks, and the marketplace, occupied by the Chinese, is as dirty as all the others of which I have made mention. The longest street, or rather the only one, is a mile in length, and in the environs reside the agriculturists, as well as the mandarins and other government officers. The entire population numbers about 12,000 souls. The many Cambodians living in the immediate vicinity, and still more the number of chiefs who resort to Udong for business or pleasure, or are passing through it on their way from one province to another, contribute to give animation to this capital. Every moment I met mandarins, either borne in litters or on foot, followed by a crowd of slaves carrying various articles, some yellow or scarlet parasols, more or less large according to the rank of the person, others boxes with betel. I also encountered horsemen, mounted on pretty spirited little animals, richly caparisoned and covered with bells, ambling along, while a troop of attendants, covered with dust and sweltering with heat, ran after them. Light carts, drawn by a couple of small oxen, trotting along rapidly and noisily, were here and there to be seen. Occasionally a large elephant passed majestically by. On this side were numerous processions to the pagoda, marching to the sound of music. There again was a band of ecclesiastics in single file, seeking alms, draped in their yellow cloaks and with the holy vessels on their backs. The third day after my arrival at Udong, the Court of Justice was noisily opened at 8 o'clock in the morning, and the loud voices of the judges and advocates were still resounding through the hall at 5 in the afternoon, having never for an instant been hushed, when suddenly 2 pages came out of the court of the palace, crying out, "The King!" A thunderbolt falling in the hall could not have caused a greater sensation than the announcement. There was a general hurry-scurry. Judges, advocates, accused, and spectators fled pell-mell, taking refuge in the corners with their faces to the ground. I laughed to see the legal functionaries and the Chinamen with their long queues rushing against each other in their eagerness to escape at the King's approach. His Majesty, who was on foot, now appeared at the entrance, followed by his pages. He waved his hand and called me to him. Immediately 2 attendants brought chairs and placed them on the grass opposite to each other. The King offered me one, and then entered into conversation with me, while the whole escort and every one near us remained prostrate on the ground, as far as the eye could reach. Not a soul was standing. "How do you like my city?" asked the King. "Sire, it is splendid, and presents an appearance such as I have never seen elsewhere. All the palaces and pagodas which you see from here have been built in 1 year since my return from Siam. In another year all will be finished. Formerly Cambodia was very extensive, but the Annamites have deprived us of many provinces. Sire, the time has arrived for you to retake them. The French are assailing them on one side. Do you attack them on the other?" His Majesty did not reply, but offered me a cigar and inquired my age. "I am 23, he said to me. "I recognize you. You were at Siam with M. de Montigny." "No, sire, your Majesty is mistaken. I have only been in Siam a 12-month. I then sent for an elegant small Minié rifle, which the King's officers had examined in the morning, and presented it to him, asking if he would deign to accept it. He desired me to load it, which I did. "It is done, sir," said I. "Is it possible? Fire, then." He chose for a target to post some way off, and pointed out the place he wished for me to hit. I fired, and immediately His Majesty and the pages were to satisfy themselves that the aim was true. "When do you wish to leave Udong?" "Sire, I should like to depart the day after tomorrow for Pinhalu and the other provinces. If you could remain 1 day longer, it would give me pleasure. Tomorrow you will dine with me. On the day after I will take you to see the town of the first king, and in the evening we will have a play." The play, I thought, would be curious, and therefore I decided to remain, and after I had thanked the King for his kindness to me, he shook hands with me, and we separated. Evidently I was in high favour. On the following morning messengers came from the King to place horses at my disposal, should I be inclined to ride, but the heat was too great. About 4 in the afternoon he again did me the honour of sending a horse to bring me to the palace. I wore a white coat, vest, and trousers, a helmet made of cork, and the fashion of the ancient Romans, and covered with white muslin, completed my singular toilet. I was introduced by the chamberlain into one of the King's private apartments, a pretty room furnished in the European style. His Majesty sat waiting for me, smoking near a table covered with refreshments, and as soon as I entered he rose, and holding out his hand and smiling, he begged me to sit down and begin my repast. I perceived that he intended, after the manner of the country, to do me the honour of being present at the meal without partaking of it himself. After introducing me with much courtesy and friendliness to his brother, a young man of 15, who was kneeling by his side, the king said, "I have had this fowl and duck cooked in the European fashion. Tell me if they are to your taste." All had been really exceedingly well prepared. The fish, particularly, was capital. "Good brandy," said the king in English, the only words he knew in that language, as he pointed to a bottle of cognac. "Drink," continued he. The attendants then placed before me jellies and exquisitely preserved fruits, bananas, and excellent mangoes. Afterwards tea was served, of which the king also partook, having first offered me a Manila cigar. He then wound up a musical box and put it on the table. The first air gave me great pleasure, all the more because I was unprepared to hear it in a royal palace. It was the Marseillaise. The king took my start and look of astonishment for admiration. "Do you know that air?" he asked. "Yes, sire." Then followed another scarcely less familiar, the air of the Girondins, "Mourir pour la patrie." "Do you also know that?" As an answer, I accompanied the air with the words, "Does your Majesty like this air?" I inquired. "Not so well as the first." "Your Majesty is right. Most European sovereigns have the same taste." "Napoleon, for instance?" "Napoleon, particularly." My Annamite was with me, and filled the office of interpreter with a perfect tact which pleased the king. The young prince now asked permission to retire, and saluted his brother by bowing to the earth, and raising his clasped hands above his head. The king desired him to return the next morning, and accompany us to the palace of the first king, and the prince, passing out into the courtyard, was lifted astride on the shoulders of an attendant, and carried to his palace. His Majesty then displayed to me his European furniture, mahogany tables covered with china vases and other ornaments of a commonplace description. Above all, he pointed out, as worthy of notice, 2 old looking-glasses in gilt frames, a sofa, and various similar articles. "I am but beginning," said he. "In a few years my palace will be beautiful." He afterwards took me into his garden, where were some rare and curious plants, and a miniature artificial rock. Then, on returning to the sitting-room, he conducted me past the inmates of his seraglio, at least 100 in number, whom curiosity had brought me out to gaze at the stranger. "You are the first foreigner who has ever been admitted here," he said to me. "In Cambodia, as in Siam, no one but the people on duty can penetrate into the king's private apartments." I thanked him for the honour he had done me, and took leave. He told me to ask for all I wanted, and he would refuse no request. The only thing I desired was to have my journey facilitated, and to this end I begged him to furnish me with letters to the chiefs of the different provinces of his dominions, and 1 or 2 elephants. This he promised to do. This young sovereign is the presumptive heir to the crown. His father, who owes his throne to the King of Siam, is not permitted by that monarch to leave his own country, and as a guarantee of his fidelity, 1 or 2 of his sons have always been retained as hostages at the Siamese court. It was thus that the young king passed many years at Bangkok, where, doubtless, he learnt the art of government, and whence he was not allowed to return to his own kingdom till it was apparent that he would prove a submissive and obedient tributary. Another brother, a prince of 21, paid me a visit at night, unknown to his relatives, hoping to receive a present. He was very childish for his age, and wanted everything he saw. He was, however, gentle and amiable, and of superior manners. The next morning the king sent for me at 10 o'clock. I found him seated on a sofa in the reception hall, giving orders to his pages about the order of march to be observed in going and returning. When all was ready, he entered a sedan chair or palanquin magnificently carved and painted. His head and feet were bare, his hair cut in the Siamese fashion, and he wore a superb languti of yellow silk, with a girdle of the same material, but of a lighter shade. The palanquin was borne on the shoulders of 4 attendants, and another held up an enormous red parasol, with a gilt handle upwards of 12 feet long. The youngest prince, carrying the king's sabre, walked beside him. I was on the other side, and His Majesty often turned towards me to point out any striking object, and trying to read in my face what I thought of the effect produced on the people by his appearance. He sat in a careless attitude, 1 leg hanging out of the palanquin, and with his elbow resting on the morocco cushions. At the approach of the procession, all the collected population bowed themselves to the ground. In front marched 3 lictors, bearing in their hands bundles of rattans, the emblems of power. Behind the palanquin came 2 and 2, The chamberlains and pages, numbering more than 30, all dressed in red and bearing on their shoulders pikes, sabres, or guns in cases. In this order we arrived at the outer entrance of the palace of the first king. His Majesty here descended from his palanquin, and still in the same order of march, we proceeded along an avenue about half a mile in length, planted with young trees, and bounded on either side by a wooden fence. The ground slopes gradually from hence, and is laid out in gardens and lawns, encircling which are 100 little cottages with walls of clay and thatched roofs. All these houses are inhabited by my father's wives. There is not a man in them, said the young king. Farther on was a lake, surrounded with rich and luxuriant verdure. On its banks, buried in foliage which is reflected in the clear water, stands the royal residence, part of which is of bamboo, the rest being whitewashed. We went through several apartments, in which poor Annamite women were wearing silk, and after passing in front of the treasury and the king's magazines, finally reached a vast hall, which here is peculiarly called the palace. The interior does not come up to what might be expected from an outside view. It is stocked like a bazaar, with glass bottles, vases filled with artificial flowers and covered by glass shades, cushions of all colours and sizes, boxes, slippers, old sofas, looking-glasses, washing stands, and a variety of European articles piled upon tables and shelves, and on the floor. As the young king was to spend the day at the palace, he now dismissed me, appointing one of his chamberlains to escort me home. A little after sunset, the people collected in crowds to witness the play which was to be performed on the king's return, expected at 7 o'clock. The multitude was so dense that not a single inch of ground in the courtyard was unoccupied, and the walls, even, were all covered. At these festivities, the people are apparently permitted to depart from the customary posture of humility, for everyone was seated in Oriental fashion. The play was simply a phantasmagoria, tolerably well managed, and accompanied by music more noisy than harmonious, but which appeared perfectly to satisfy the public. End of chapter 7.